It is Weather Wagers time. We are quickly sneaking up on season 2 of this podcast, but we're not quite there yet. And someone, I come back to the scene here, to the desk, to our Digital Now Center, and someone decided to leave us.
Well, he's in the Great White North, exploring the mountainous regions of Canada or something on the company dime.
Apparently so, yeah. Allegedly, the Canadian Rockies is where Brett is heading. I've never been myself. I've flown over the Rockies.
Yeah.
I don't know what there is to do in the Rockies, but apparently he's going to send back a video diary every day. So if you're interested,
great. Hopefully he's wearing that nice fedora he has in our graphic package.
I could see him with a bucket hat.
Maybe, yeah.
I could see a Phillies bucket hat or maybe an Eagles throwback bucket hat. But we'll get into Brett more in a little bit because he actually did contribute to this podcast.
Of course.
And I should introduce ourselves. I'm Dan Tomaso. This is Dave Shiner alongside. And, you filled in for me. Now you're filling in for Brett.
Bringing in the lefty again, as they say.
Yeah, that's right. The Swiss Army knife. And I will be away next week, too. But we have plenty of content. And then we're back to a normal schedule as we get into college football season in earnest. But just a couple of news and notes here to start out. First, it's a big day in the sports world. I mean, it's been a big week. NFL teams opening up training camp. It kind of feels like spring training baseball, right?
It's right around the corner. At the end of the summer here, everybody starts showing up, and it always is interesting to me that all these different NFL teams, and in baseball too, everybody reports at like different times. Why don't we just set a regular date and everybody gets,
I don't know what I understand
kind of start,
less.
but I don't know if it's facilities you're dealing with, whatever. But either way, football's around the corner.
The corner. I don't understand the report dates. I don't understand OTAs in the NFL. The NFL is very scheduled, and then in some regards, it's not.
Yeah.
But they're there. So the
all
Eagles,
for player safety, of course.
All for player safety. I'm hoping there's a lot of load management going on in the Eagles training camp because we got to get through training camp with Jalen Hurts, the offensive line, and the big boys at wide receiver and tight end intact. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, we all know OTAs are more for the rookies and the less veteran players, if you will. But, it gets everybody kind of in the mood. They start, they don't quite have pads on yet. But just to get everybody in the facility, it knows that football's around the corner.
And from what I can tell from some of the reports coming in early was that Nick Sirianni showed a video of the confetti at the Super Bowl. It's kind of like, we got to get back there. We got to earn it. It starts over again. And that's the shame of any sports season, that you go on a run like that. I mean, the Eagles were almost unbeatable last year. Almost.
Oh, yeah.
And now you're starting from square one.
Well, you see this all the time in the end of the big game where the losing team, kind of sits around and dwells in their loss a little bit, maybe for motivation for the next year. Yeah. And I think that was Nick's deal. He wanted to get all the talk of the Super Bowl hangover out of the way. Hey, this is where we were, last year. It hurt.
It did.
Use that to fuel the fire, and let's get back at it and see what we can do this year.
And I've kind of tortured myself. If you haven't watched yet, Netflix put out a series, executive producer Peyton Manning. It's called The Quarterback, and it's about the hardest position in sports, or so they say. And it follows Marcus Mariota, now an Eagle, but was a Falcon last year, follows Kirk Cousins, who's also an interesting kind of character to follow in many ways.
Yeah.
A little robotic at times, but he's there. And then the effervescent Patrick Mahomes. I mean, just watching some of his game tape from last year, I just keep thinking to myself as I'm watching this, I haven't finished it yet, but how do you beat this guy? Because he just makes it up on the fly, and the team around him really wasn't that special last year. There were players,
obviously you got Kelsey and some other big-time players. But
he's just unreal. And to me, it just, the way this season kind of funnels is a potential rematch.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully. I mean, I know the Eagles' schedule is quite daunting, at least according to last year's teams.
Right, correct.
We always know there's the worst to first and all that happens, but they have that stretch in the late October, early November into December where it's a murder's row of all the good playoff teams, let alone some divisional rivals. But the one thing that I've heard about just the way Patrick Mahomes has been in that show is, I mean, you get why he's so good. And you hear about that with the greats. Like, not only do they have the talent, but the work ethic is out of this world.
His workouts, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. But just his demeanor, nothing phases him.
Yeah.
I mean, in the show, nothing phases him. Now, again, this is edited and
of course,
following the player around. But, I mean, he's unflappable.
Yeah.
And to me, Jalen Hurts kind of has that same mentality.
Oh yeah.
He not much bothers him, and so that's kind of how you know you're in a different stratosphere.
Yeah.
I think.
Oh, he's also known for his work ethic too,
Yes.
as well as
Yes.
Jalen. And the thing that I've noticed that's pretty cool about it is, Kirk Cousins is sort of kind of like, I don't want to say he's the scapegoat of the league, but he's the guy that's like, oh, why is he getting paid all this? And you know what? He's more cerebral than I ever thought he
Yes.
was, at least from what we expect on the field. But just seeing how all these guys, 1 through 32 that are starters in the NFL, what they have to actually go through to be starters in this league, and it's pretty impressive.
And how they get beat up because they show they show countless times the hits that he took. I mean, the offensive line for the Vikings, they better revamp that entire thing because it was bad. But what I thought was interesting too is if you didn't know Kirk Cousins was an NFL quarterback, the physique, he's not jacked.
Well, we've seen the pictures of a young Tom Brady at the
it's
combine where you're
bizarre.
like, this guy's the greatest of all time.
Right.
And he just kind of looked like a dude with a dad bod, but he's since obviously
Yeah.
changed his physique a little bit. But yeah, I mean, even a guy like Peyton Manning, he's a very tall guy. He's not slender by any means, but when you're 6'6" and 2 something, I mean, you're just a different person and a different athletic prowess anyway.
Yeah, so very interesting show there. I wasn't fully anticipating getting into it, but it is kind of part of the show that we're kind of previewing what's going on in the NFL. Real quick, I want to mention the Phillies. Been on a bit of a slide, starting with the Corbin Burns start last week. It seems like the offense has not been right since that game.
Yeah, and they've had some real close games.
Yes,
with
and you
the
are going to lose
Brewers,
those.
Yeah, you are. And even last night, obviously, we're recording this on a Tuesday. They played the Orioles in the first of a 3-game set, and that was, again, a real close game. Went to the bottom of the ninth, and the Phillies had their chances.
Yes,
Bryce
they did.
Harper gets called out on a first home off of a single, and, that might have been
A lot of weird things last night.
Yeah, but I'm not losing hope just because all of these games have been these one-run games. We're not seeing those huge 10-0 blowouts. We're seeing the 5-4 games, the 3-2 games, pitchers duels, but you still need that timely hitting. And, they've gotten it in some places, but they've also, Kimbrel's actually had his first 2 blown saves of his season, I believe.
Correct. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And, again, some of these trends were always going to reverse. He wasn't going to be perfect all
He wasn't going to be Brad Lidge, you're telling me?
No, his stuff is not that devastating.
No.
I still have never seen a slider the way Lidge has moved in his prime.
Yeah.
But I will say, they're playing playoff teams. They're keeping the games close. It's a solo home run here or a miscue there that's been the difference. And I expect that to turn around. And there's a lot of hate right now, unfortunately, for Trey Turner. Folks, he's going to be fine.
Yeah, I mean, he's already shown himself a couple times this year, and you can't. I don't know. I mean, I think everybody expected him to hit 50 home runs and bat 400, but that's not him.
Well, and I think part of the problem is he's expecting that right now too. And it's a mental game. And if we learned anything from Nick Castellanos last year, the first year with the new team in a city with high expectations, it doesn't always go well the first go around.
Yeah, and I mean, even Nick kind of proved everybody wrong with his All-Star bid. Now, of course, he's hitting a little slide, but that's baseball. That's the thing. Like, baseball is a series of ebb and flows, and that goes from the pitchers on down to the hitting,
And I'll say this again. I would much rather be in the Phillies position than some of these teams that started hot and faded, whether it's the Pirates. The Rays are really fading right now. And they're
in the
they're
last
in trouble.
20 games for sure. And that's allowing the good old Orioles. I mean, if I had to pick my my AL team, I mean, we'll go with the bums from Baltimore. And it's great to see them kind of making their certain. They were one of those bottom rung teams barely getting 60 wins, and now they have 61 already, and we're just a little bit past the halfway of the season.
And that's how a season can go. I mean, the Phillies could go on a run here too and kind of cement themselves in the wild card, but they're right there.
All you got to do is hang out. You got to hang out until it's time to step on the gas and hopefully have a similar run that they had last year.
Absolutely. And speaking of hanging out, so I mentioned, Brett's not here, but he is actually here in spirit more ways than one. We got to talk to, there he is, the great Phil Steele. Now, I will caution you, we actually don't get to see Phil in the interview. He was over the phone with us, but we were able to Zoom with him and talk all about college football. And the interview is wide, encompassing the entire landscape. So the only thing we really don't touch on is the group of 5, which I know we will be previewing ourselves coming up, but every conference. And just to preview a little bit of the interview, I mean, he answered everything like that. There was no hesitation. We asked detailed questions, and he was all over it.
I mean, he is the man who is in charge of the Bible of college football, and quote unquote. So, I mean,
speaking
to
of
have
that,
him here is pretty awesome.
Do you want to see the East Coast cover of said Bible?
Look at that. We got there in the bottom right corner.
There's Olu Fashanu, and he could be one of the top draft picks in this year's NFL draft. So very interesting stuff there with Phil. Without further ado, I should say, let's roll the tape.
Well, our guest today is well known to college football fans and writes the premier preview magazine every year. We are so pleased to chat with Phil Steele on Weather Wagers this week about all things college football. Phil has spent the last several months chatting with head coaches, running his computer models, and gathering data about each and every team. He is here now to break it all down for us. Phil, thanks for taking some time to be with us today. We appreciate that. We're going to start with a team we follow closely on this podcast, the Penn State Nittany Lions. They're getting a lot of buzz, Phil. They have a running back duo that might be one of the best in the country, a stellar defense led by the returning Manny Diaz, and a potential breakout QB with Drew Aller. What do you make of Penn State, and what did your conversation with Coach Franklin reveal?
Well, first of all, let's address the conversation with the coach. Generally, what I do is I talk to 123 of the 133 head coaches this year, and it's not your typical interview of a head coach. What I do is I send them over my team pages, which have every player listed on the team, have all my notes, all the stats, and then I ask the coach to go over each player with me. Calls generally take about an hour. Go over each player with me, strengths and weaknesses, and then wrap up the positions. Probably the one thing that really stood out to me about the conversation with Coach Franklin was, the depth on the defense. In fact, I don't think he's ever felt this good about the overall depth. He feels they go 3 deep at every single position, basically every single position on the defense. And then offensively, he said that the offensive line has a chance to be one of the best offensive lines he's had since they've been there. So I love depth on defense, and I love good offensive lines. Those would be probably the 2 main things that I took out of the conversation with Coach Franklin. But this is a Penn State team. Let's face it, they are a legitimate contender in the East, as well as a legitimate national title contender. You touched on it at running back with Singleton and Allen, and they also had in Treson Potts from Minnesota. It's a very deep running back core that I rate number 3 in the entire country. The offensive line, which Coach Franklin says is one of his best units, I rate number 14. Their quarterback could give them upgraded quarterback play. Who knows? He's 6'5", 230, the much anticipated starting debut at Drew Aller. And then, as mentioned, the defense, all 3 units rank in my top 4, so that's a dynamite defense. You want to have good special teams. They still rank number 28 in my special teams unit. So really, they are a complete team. When you look at the schedule this year, naturally playing Ohio State on the road is going to be a tough game. They get Michigan at home, and if you remember the last time they got Michigan at home, the Wolverines needed that late touchdown to pull out a 21-17 win. They also do draw Iowa out of the West. I think Iowa and Wisconsin are the 2 best teams in the West. So not a super easy schedule for Penn State, but a very manageable one. And how they fare against Ohio State and Michigan will determine whether or not this team is a legitimate playoff contender.
So, we love hearing all this buzz about the strengths, Phil, but obviously there's got to be some potential weaknesses, some pitfalls here, right? I mean, personally, I've said this on the podcast, I need to see it from the new quarterback, Drew Aller, especially under pressure in the big situations in the Big Ten. What can we be sure about what he is and who the staff thinks he is? And what about the wide receiver room? Isn't that a potential weak group?
Yeah, well, definitely the quarterback question mark. Anytime you have a first-year starting quarterback, I mean, everybody looks good in practice. Everybody loves the backup quarterback. And Drew is a guy that's a prototypical pro-style quarterback. He's big and strong. He can make all the throws. But as you mentioned, I mean, he's only got 60 career attempts, and he's looked good. Hasn't really come in when you're facing the other team's number 1 defense. And it'll be interesting to see how he plays out. So that would be probably my biggest question mark. When you go to the receiving core, losing guys like Washington and Tinsley is tough, but they do return Keandre Lambert-Smith. They add in Dante Cephas, who I like from Kent State. He's a guy that was first-team MAC. He's 6'1", 178, and could be a very solid receiver, but the depth of receiver is probably a question mark. It is one of the better tight end rooms in the country with Theo Johnson, Tyler Warren, and even Dinkins. I would expect to see 12 personnel a good portion of the time this year because the strength, I believe, of the receiving core is actually the tight end.
Wow. All right. Well, that's certainly a good spin on their passing game, and hopefully it allows them to contend in the Big Ten with the two big boys, Ohio State and Michigan. Now, Michigan has beaten the Buckeyes the last 2 years in a row. Jim Harbaugh seems to have found the recipe for getting at the Buckeyes, but Ryan Day almost upset Georgia in the playoff last year and continues to load up that team with talent. Are these two teams ready to tangle again this season? I mean, does it play out like it did last year? And which one do you like better out of the two?
Yeah, it could very well do that again. In fact, if you look in the magazine, I rate the Power Poll, which is where I rank the teams talent-wise this year. I've got Ohio State number 2 in the country, and keep in mind, they were a missed field goal away from being the national champs last year. I think if the field goal went through against Georgia, naturally they win the game by 2 points. They go on and play TCU, and I think Ohio State's talent, similar to Georgia, would have gotten past TCU and made them the national champs. And with Michigan, a very disappointing playoff game against TCU, one where maybe some pregame talk about how they were going to dominate the line of scrimmage and run the football down TCU's throat. I know I talked to Coach Dykes, and he said that really motivated his team to get out there and try to stop the run. And we saw that happen. They had a lot of short yardage situations where TCU just beat them off the ball and stopped them, especially near the goal line, and really turned the tide on that game. But this looks like Jim Harbaugh's best team that he's had in his 9 years. And now they've got 2 years of playoff experience. If they're ever going to get through and get to the championship game, this would be the year to do it. I think Michigan faces the best schedule of the 3 teams. As mentioned, Penn State not only has to play Ohio State on the road and play Michigan home, but they draw Iowa out of the West. I think Michigan's got the best schedule. I rate it number 67 in the country. The non-conference slate's easy. East Carolina, UNLV, and Bowling Green. Conference play, they play at Nebraska, at Minnesota, both very winnable. The only game I don't have them favored in, I've got the Penn State game, a toss-up game, and they do get Ohio State at home. Ohio State, meanwhile, has got a tougher schedule. They have to play Notre Dame on the road. I consider Notre Dame a legitimate playoff contender. They have to play Wisconsin on the road, and they play Wisconsin on the road the week after Ohio State plays Penn State. So a potential letdown spot, and I also have Wisconsin, my number 1 surprise team in the country, and then they also play Michigan on the road. So those 3 tough road games have me calling for Ohio State not making the playoff, despite the fact I have them the number 2 team in the country talent-wise. So it should be an interesting mix. As mentioned, I've got 3 teams. I originally, guys, when I looked at it, said, okay, I'm going to go with whichever one gets the other 2 at home. And naturally, Michigan plays Penn State on the road. Ohio State plays Michigan on the road, and Penn State plays Ohio State on the road.
Yeah, that makes it, at least it'll be entertaining. There's no doubt. But before we move to those 2 teams you mentioned from the West, I just want to stay in the East for one more second. What is your take on Michigan State, Phil? I'm curious. Mel Tucker got the new contract, but struggled mightily last season. He also lost some players to the portal. One wonders exactly what's happening up there in East Lansing, and if the program can climb back or continue to possibly crater this year. Where do you have Michigan State this year?
I don't even have them making a bowl game this year. Once again, it'd be the second straight year for that. And let's go back and take a closer look at that season where Mel Tucker got them to 7-2 in the Big Ten and an outstanding finish at 11-2. That season, they were actually outgained by 63 yards per game in Big Ten play. So they weren't quite as good as the record would indicate. In fact, generally, if you're minus 63 yards in Big Ten play and you're playing 9 games, you're 3-6. You know, it's so I thought they did it with smoke and mirrors that season. Last year it was more what we expected. They had them to 5-7. Now their most impressive game of the year, 2 games, was beating Wisconsin and then beating Illinois on the road. I was surprised that Mel Tucker was able to get that. But as you touched on, after spring practice was over, they lose their quarterback and top wide receiver, both to the transfer portal. Keon Coleman going to go on be one of the best wide receivers out there. They lose their star punter from last season. I have question marks in a lot of areas. The only 2 units that rank in my top units are defensive line and linebacker. And when you look at the schedule, I have an underdog against Washington at home, at Iowa, home against Michigan, at Minnesota, at Ohio State, and then Penn State, and with a couple of toss-up games on the schedule as well, including Maryland Week 4. So I think this is a team that comes up short of a bowl bid and is still in the rebuilding mode.
Wow. So it's some unfortunate news there for the Sparty fans. Let's move westward a little bit more and talk about Iowa, a team that always gives Penn State fans indigestion. A lot of battles over the years. They pick up Michigan's other quarterback, Cade McNamara. They continue to use Brian Ferentz as their OC, which obviously got a lot of criticism last year. He has it written in his contract that the Hawkeyes must average at least 25 points per game if he wants to keep his job beyond this upcoming season. Is it doable? And is Iowa the darling to make a run in the West? I know you mentioned Wisconsin, but Iowa seems pretty primed.
Yeah, Iowa looks really good this year. And yes, they should be able to top 25 points. I know after watching Iowa's offense last year and the year before when they only averaged 23 points, you're thinking, can this offense even do it? But let's keep in mind, in 2020, they averaged 32 points per game with the same type of offense. And, guys, the second Cade McNamara hit the portal, true story. I saw the name hit the portal, and the first thing that popped in my head within the first 5 seconds was go to Iowa. And sure enough, he ends at Iowa. And not only comes over to Iowa, but he brings his tight end with him, and Eric All, who was injured last year after 2 starts. I think Iowa is known for their tight ends. They've got the tight ends now with All and Lachey. Cade McNamara gives them the quarterback they've been lacking the last couple of years. The offensive line has had 2 sort of rebuilding years. Remember 2 years ago, they had their star center back, and they had 4 newcomers to the offensive line. Last year, they lost their center and still had a lot of youngsters, including 2 freshmen that started. This year, they have finally a veteran offensive line. Defensively, they're among the best in the country. And, I wondered why Nick Jackson sat in the portal for so long after leaving Virginia. I thought he was one of the best linebackers in the country out of Virginia last year. Jackson lands at Iowa and is going to be the guy that replaces Jack Campbell. So I like that replacement. Special teams, always among the best. I've rated him number 2 in the country this year. They've got Torrey Taylor, who is the best punter in the country, switches the field position. They got Drew Stevens at kicker. So they're solid on defense, improved on offense, solid on special teams. The only reason I didn't pick them to win the West is 2 road games. They have to play Penn State on the road and Wisconsin on the road. But if you told me at the end of the year, Iowa wins. In fact, they're my number 7 surprise team in the country, or a non-top 10 team that I think have a shot at making a playoff. It wouldn't put it past it. Kirk Ferentz, one of the best head coaches out there, and this is a complete team this season, unlike last year where they lacked an offense.
Let's move on. Speaking of that, to the team that you do favor, Wisconsin made a surprising move early last season, fired Paul Chryst. They bring in Luke Fickell, no stranger to the Big Ten there, and the program is likely going to be overhauled a bit from what we're used to. I was going to ask you if they can compete in the West. Well, you think they can. You think they can win it. Do you expect Luke Fickell to really take this program to new heights?
Yeah, and first of all, guys, I don't know what your thoughts, but when they got rid of Chryst to promote Jim Leonard to interim head coach, I thought they did that because they didn't want to lose Leonard to somebody that was looking for a head coach. And I was pretty surprised when they brought in, when they didn't hire Leonard as the head coach. And I'll be honest, it takes 7 months to write this magazine, guys. And the first write-through process I do is what I call the postseason write-through. Now, I've got 12 TVs in front of me. I watch every single game every single week during the season. I've lived the season. But then I go through after the season's over and I read through every article that is written about the team for the entire year. And that takes me through the ebbs and flows of each position. When I did that, I was a little concerned about the Fickell hiring because he's bringing in Phil Longo from North Carolina. They're going to switch to more of a pass offense, which I'm like, you know what? Wisconsin wins its games in November because they run the football and they win their games. And now they're going to a pass offense. I was very concerned. However, after going over the team with Coach Fickell, they're not abandoning the run. They're not just going to go to a pass offense. They brought in Tanner Mordecai from SMU. They will throw the football more. However, if you follow Fickell's teams at Cincinnati, they also had 1,000-yard rushers. And he feels that now teams are not going to be able to stack 8-9 players in the box to stop the run game. It's going to open up holes for Braylon Allen and Ches Maluzzi, and those guys will be more effective. And keep in mind, Allen last year averaged 5.4 yards a carry. I would expect him to average over 6 this year. Maluzzi only averaged 4.2. I would expect him to average over 5. So with more space and the fact that they are not abandoning the run game, Wisconsin's offense will still be strong. Now, defensively, last year they only had 3 returning starters. This year they have 8. In fact, overall, the team goes from number 107 in my experience chart to number 20. Then you factor in the schedule this year. They play on the road, Washington State, Purdue, which I think is in a rebuilding year, Illinois, not quite as good as last year's squad, Indiana, and Minnesota. All those games fall into the winnable category. Their toughest 2 games on the schedule are Iowa, which they get at home, and Ohio State, which they catch the week after they play Penn State, perhaps in a letdown spot. So add it all up. If you're looking for this year's TCU, or a team that comes out of nowhere to actually make the playoff, I went with Wisconsin. I think they have the possibility of 11 or 12 wins during the regular season, get to the Big Ten title game, and with the offense and defense being as strong as they are this year, I would expect that they'd have a shot in that game as well. So I went with the Badgers as my number 1 surprise team and the winner of the West. But I do feel the 2 best teams by far in the West this year are Wisconsin and Iowa.
Wow. Some pretty strong statements there. I like it, though. I mean, this is what we came here for, to get some insight about who we're not thinking about. Let's move to the Pac-12 and some of these teams now moving over to the Big Ten in a year's time, USC being one of them. This should be their conference to lose, right? Has Lincoln Riley fixed his defense? Is there a defense this year? And is there anyone else in the league that we should keep our eye on?
Yeah, and the Pac-12 is actually loaded, quarterback-wise, and at the top this year. You look at the fact that Oregon brings back Bo Nix at QB. Utah brings back Cam Rising at QB. Washington brings back Michael Penix, who threw for 4,600 yards last year. USC brings back Caleb Williams. There are 6 legitimate candidates there in the Pac-12, and it's a loaded quarterback conference, maybe the best quarterback conference in college football this year. Now, did Lincoln Riley fix his defense? When I went over the team with Coach Riley, it was a priority this year to do that, and he hit the portal to fix it. And you look at some of the players he brought in, like Bear Alexander coming in from Georgia. He was my number 5 rated defensive lineman out of high school, brings 315 pounds to the interior. Anthony Lucas from Texas A&M, he was my number 6 rated defensive end out of high school, and he brings in 295 pounds to the defensive end spot. They bring in Mason Cobb, who is one of Oklahoma State's top tacklers, Christian Roland Wallace, one of the best DBs, cornerbacks, I should say, in the Pac-12. So I do think the defense will be better, and their defense does not have to be dominant because the offense is just as explosive. They got the Heisman Trophy winner in Caleb Williams, a loaded backfield, including Marshawn Lloyd, who comes over from South Carolina, one of the best receiving corps in the country, and a veteran offensive line. When you look at the schedule this year, they're probably going to be a slight dog at Notre Dame and a slight dog at Oregon. Other than that, they'll be favored in all their games. And remember, last year they went into the Pac-12 title game. Had they won that, and Caleb Williams got injured early and took 6 sacks, had that not happened and maybe he stayed healthy all game and they win that, they would have been in the playoff last year over Ohio State. So they were a definite playoff contender. When I look at the Pac-12 guys, I think it might cannibalize itself once again as a conference that just beats itself up because there's a lot of quality teams at the top in USC, Utah, Oregon, and Washington.
I mean, yeah, that's a great point, especially with all those quarterbacks. Let's move on quickly to the Big 12. I think this league could be entertaining, especially with some of the newcomers coming in. Let's ask 3 questions here. Some national pundits favor Texas to win the Big 12. Can they do it? Is Oklahoma going to be improved? And beyond those 2 big boys, Phil, who else should we be watching in the Big 12 this year?
Probably every team, because that's the way it's worked out in the Big 12. You go back to 2 years ago, Baylor came out of nowhere, won the conference. Last year, who picked TCU? And TCU ends up playing for the national title game. Whoever's at the bottom, you can't even pick Kansas last anymore, guys. But let me address Texas and Oklahoma. With Texas, I wanted to pick against them. I mean, this is a team that everybody's going to be gunning for. It's their last year in the Big 12. The schedule maker didn't do them any favors. Of all the top 6 teams in the Big 12 this year, Texas is the only one that has to play each of the other 5. So the schedule is brutal. But if you look at my magazine on page 138, where I rank the unit rankings in the conference, they rank number 1 or tied for first in all 8 positions. I mean, they are loaded talent-wise. I think Quinn Ewers steps up, has a huge year. They've got one of the best receiving corps, offensive lines, defense of every unit. Special teams are even solid. They really have the talent. So I ended up picking them to win the Big 12 this year. Now, Oklahoma has a little bit better schedule, and they do make my most improved list. They're my number 2 most improved team in the country. And Brett Venables, who I talked to him, was not happy about his defense allowing 461 yards per game and 30 points per game like they did last year. He was out to fix that. He also hit the transfer portal hard, bringing in a guy like Dason McCullough from Indiana, Reggie Pearson from Texas Tech, and numerous others to help out on the defense. Plus, he runs a complex defense and threw it all at the defense last year. Now I think in the second year, the defense will be improved. Offensively, Dylan Gabriel missed a couple games last year. Oklahoma didn't fare well. And actually in Vegas right now, guys, Oklahoma is favored in 11 of their 12 games. The only one they're not is the one against Texas. So if you're looking for a team that goes from a losing record to right towards the top, Oklahoma would be that squad this year. But the other main contenders, Kansas State, TCU, Baylor, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, even UCF, the new transfer, and Iowa State was so much better in their record. This is a deep and tough-to-predict conference, probably the toughest conference to predict of any of them.
Wow. Let's go to another conference that maybe doesn't have as much fanfare, the ACC, a league that could be facing turmoil and some teams leaving in the near future. A lot of people like Florida State this year. What's not to like after last year when they took a big step forward? Are they the threat to win the league, or is it the same old Dabo's Clemson team? Do they continue their dominance? Anybody else you're seeing in that league?
Yeah, what a difference a year makes for Florida State. Last year, Mike Norvell was on the hot seat coming off of 3-6 and 5-7 seasons his first 2 years, and now they will be the preseason favorite to win the ACC. In fact, when you look at their 7 units, I'm talking offense and defense units, all 7 units not only rank in my top units in front of the magazine, but rank in the top 15. That's how talented they are. Jordan Travis at quarterback. But I actually went with Clemson, and I've saw a lot of preseason top 25s this year, guys, that didn't even have Clemson in their top 10. I think they will barely make the top 10 in the AP poll at the start of the year. But here's one of the reasons I like Clemson. When I went over the team with Coach Sweeney, you look at their defensive line. And remember that 2018 defensive line where they were national champs and loaded with first-round draft picks. Coach Sweeney told me that this group doesn't have the star power of 2018, but it's actually deeper in talent and experience than that 2018 group, which dominated college football. That made me stand up to attention a little bit. I rank them the number 1 defensive line in the country. They've got Carter and Trotter back at linebacker, a solid secondary. Cade Klubnik in his first year as a starter. They bring in Garrett Riley, who called up plays for TCU's offense last year as the offensive coordinator. Shipley and Moffat running back, a veteran offensive line and receiving core. And their 2 toughest games this year, guys, are Florida State and Notre Dame. They get both of them at home, and they've only lost 1 home game in Death Valley the last 6 years. They've only lost 2 home games the last 9 years. So I think they take care of business at home. I have them favored in all 12 games, and I've got them rated number 2 in the country this year.
Wow. All right. We will keep an eye on Clemson. So we have a few minutes left with Phil. We're going to run through some SEC schools now, the mighty SEC. Get your thoughts on some teams we find interesting. And we're going to start with Alabama. The media picked them to win the West last week at SEC Media Days. And, Georgia's good. They're going to be headed for the three-peat. But I think Alabama's more intriguing from afar. They've got questions at QB and wide receiver. They've got 2 new coordinators, but they still have Nick Saban. Phil, can this team challenge Georgia this year, or do you see more stumbling blocks ahead for Bama?
Yeah, this is the year that Alabama's the most dangerous. When Saban's been preseason number 1, they've only won 1 national title. They've been preseason number 1 each of the last 2 years and lost 2 games, horrific seasons in both years for them. I mean, they only finished number 5 in the country last year, guys. They lost 2 games on the final play of the game. You mentioned the quarterbacks, and I agree. Wondering who the quarterback is big, but they've got Tyler Buckner, Jalen Milroe, Ty Simpson, 3 quality guys. Whoever wins the job, I think, will have a good year. Saban's got all that talent there. Saban knows how to win. Yes, it's an inexperienced squad, but somehow, some way, I think he'll cobble it together. And remember, the last time they weren't preseason number 1 was 2020. They went 13-0 that year. So I think Saban does get it done, and they win the West. And Georgia, though, very capable of a three-peat. When you look at this team defensively, they're actually more experienced than they were last year. Offensively, they have my number 1 rated offensive line in the country, my number 4 receivers, number 6 running backs. And I think Carson Beck, now in his 4th year of the Georgia system, this guy is 6'4", 215 pounds, and he has got a great supporting cast. And Georgia's actually going to be a double-digit favorite in their first 10 games. So by the time he gets a true road test, he'll have 10 starts under his belt. I did favor Georgia as my pick to win it all this year and be that first team since the 1930s when the Minnesota Golden Gophers won the national title. And I was not around, neither was my magazine back then.
Unfortunately, but that is just incredible. Let's turn to another team in the West, LSU. I mean, what's not to love about Brian Kelly? A lot of people like what he's bringing back this year, especially after surprising many folks last year. The talent appears to be there, Phil, but what do you think about the depth of this team? What do you think of their roster, and can they threaten Bama in the West?
They can't threaten them, but they do have to play them on the road. Last year, they won that thing in overtime on a 2-point conversion at home. Bama's almost unbeatable at home. Meanwhile, they've been struggling on the road the last 2 years. In fact, I think Bama's toughest game this year might be at Texas A&M when they have to play in College Station. With LSU, they open up against that Florida State team we talked about. They also have to play Ole Miss on the road, Bama on the road. They do have to play A&M. I think they're a legitimate contender in the West, but the fact they have to play Alabama on the road, Alabama's playing with legitimate revenge. I think the Tide win that one, but it is a very talented LSU team.
Real quick here, Phil, just want to ask about one of our favorites, Jimbo Fisher, the Aggies of Texas A&M. They're desperate. They have a new OC and Bobby Petrino, kind of coming in as maybe the savior. Jim Chaney, now an offensive analyst. I mean, they appear to have the talent. They appear to have the right minds on the football program trying to help them. Is this a year they finally get it right?
You know, they are my number one most improved team in the country and number two surprise team. I think Texas A&M is going to be a surprise player in the West. And, you know, it goes back to my conversations with Coach Fisher last year. And he would wrap up a lot of the positions, like the offensive line. He'd give you an example. He said, Phil, we're going to have one of the best offensive lines in college football next year. They were only number 124 on the experience chart. They had very few returning starters, very little experience. They lost their top wide receiver, Anais Smith, after 4 games. Due to injuries, they started 3 different starting quarterbacks. They had a lot of injuries on the defensive side of the ball, along the offensive line as well, and they struggled to a miserable 5-7 season. But we just talked about Alabama and LSU, right? Last year, they beat LSU 38-23. Last year, they're at Alabama's 2-yard line on the road with a chance to win the game, down by 4 points, thrown in the end zone, and they just came up short, or else they would have beaten both Alabama and LSU in their miserable 5-7 season. This year, they go from number 124 in my experience chart all the way up to number 14. This is the year Jimbo Fisher was talking to me about last year, and they've got 10 starters back on offense, 10 on defense. I think A&M's a legitimate player, not only in the West, but nationally this year.
Wow. All right. Two more quick questions here. The first one, let's go to the East. I think one of the main contenders for Georgia is going to be Tennessee. They host Georgia. That's that game you mentioned where Georgia finally has a legitimate road test. They're going to try to recapture some of the magic from last year. Josh Heupel returns this time with Joe Milton behind the center. The wheels came off a bit at the end of last season thanks to some injuries, but they were able to end on a high note by beating Clemson in the Orange Bowl. I mean, this is Georgia's biggest threat in their own division, right?
Absolutely. Tennessee's defense has improved. They've got the run game, a very underrated run game, because they don't have a 1,000-yard rusher. They just have 4 guys back that all ran for over 400 yards. The key is going to be Joe Milton. Joe Milton has the arm strength. He's got the size. NFL scouts drooling over him. Can he recapture what Hendon Hooker did last year, which was 27 touchdown passes, 2 interceptions? If he can keep the current turnovers cut down, I think Tennessee has that possibility. Now, they do draw Bama out of the West, which is not a good draw. Georgia doesn't have such a draw. So there'll be an underdog there. But if they beat Georgia in that 11th game of the season, they would have a chance of getting there. So I think they're going to make things interesting. If anybody's going to challenge Georgia in the East, it's Tennessee.
And give us one dark horse you like in the SEC to maybe come out of nowhere. You know, you mentioned some teams in the other conferences. Who's somebody maybe we need to keep an eye on this year in the SEC?
I don't think any of the other teams in the East challenge Georgia, Tennessee, but I would have to say South Carolina's got the best shot because they get both Florida and Kentucky at home this year. So they've got the schedule to perhaps get there, but they also play Georgia and Tennessee on the road. But to go back to last year, this team's 6-4. They're about to play number 5 Tennessee. Excuse me, as a 22-point dog. They pull the upset. And next week they play number 7 Clemson, pull the upset, knocked both teams last year out of the playoff. Had Tennessee or Clemson beaten South Carolina last year, they would have made the playoff. So it's a South Carolina team that's proven they can play with the big boys. So that would be my choice for 3rd in the East this year.
That's great, Phil. We appreciate your time. Can you tell everybody where they can find your magazine and follow along with your all of the great things you do for college football?
I appreciate that, guys. You know, the magazine's 352 pages. I really feel like it's getting 133 media guides rolled into one. It's got 3 to 4 times the amount of information in any other magazine. Now, in years past, you could pretty much get it anywhere. Walk into a Walmart, grocery store, a place like that. But this year, it's exclusively at Barnes & Noble and Books A Million. The only two mortar stores that you can, brick and mortar stores you can get it in are Barnes & Noble and Books A Million. Now, you can also go online to philsteele.com. And when you go to philsteele.com and order it, I'm going to charge you a shipping charge. Naturally, it costs to mail things. However, when you get the hard copy at philsteele.com, we also give you the digital magazine absolutely free. And the digital magazine's updated all the way through the start of the season. As an example, the Northwestern head coach right now in the digital magazine is David Braun, who, of course, replaced Pat Fitzgerald. So you can get the hard copy and the digital at philsteele.com, or head over to Books A Million or Barnes & Noble and get your copy today, but you'll be using it all season long.
Well, Phil, this was great stuff. As always, we appreciate it. We get the magazine every year. Thank you so much for your time here on Weather Wagers. We greatly appreciate it.
Hey, it was a lot of fun talking football with you guys today, Brett and Dan.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it, Phil.
Phil.
Thanks so
Do
much.
it again. Have a good one.
That was Phil Steele at philsteele.com, and once again, here's the front cover of his magazine. It is famous. If you are a college football guru, you know about this magazine. Any media member that covers college football likely has a copy of this because it's your go-to. And I will just quickly say that he's very, very high on Penn State. Now, I think the issue is he's also very high on Michigan and Ohio State. Could it be the same problem all over again we've been mentioning on this podcast?
Well, I believe he has Penn State 6
Yes.
in his top 25 preseason, with Ohio State at 5, just outside. And
Correct.
obviously Michigan's in the top 4. So it's kind of tough when you have 3 teams in the top 6 that are all going to have to play each other here this year. And it's going to be, who can stay clean. I mean,
Correct.
we could have everybody takes a loss from each other, and you never know how it's going to pan out. But, I mean, it's better than not being ranked at all in the preseason.
It's totally better than not being ranked. I think what I caution a lot of fans about is just simply the expectations that are set out for a brand new quarterback, an offense that at times sputters. So that's without a new quarterback. And yes, the defense returns starters, but is it still enough to beat those big boys? And we're going to see. I mean, Alabama's season last year came down to 2 possessions.
Yep. That it did.
It could happen with Penn State, and that's the heartbreaking part about college football, and that's why the 12-team playoff just has to happen.
Well, it's around the corner, if it doesn't even go to 16 here down the line, I mean.
Follow the money.
With all the different TV options, and obviously we're always talking about how this TV money comes into play. It would solve a lot of other West Coast teams maybe problems with trying to get on the old tube there,
Well, and I think, too, USC moving into the Big Ten, UCLA moving into the Big Ten, something's going to have to give because there's just not enough room for all these talented teams. I also thought it was very interesting. My other tidbit that I took out of the interview is he's still a believer in Dabo and Clemson, even though Florida State is the darling of a lot of pundits' picks right now for the ACC. So even though that's not one of the major so-called, major contenders for playoff, that should be a very interesting battle to the end. It's one, we haven't talked a lot about on this show. We focus a lot about the SEC, the Big Ten, the big boys, so to speak, but that could be entertaining too.
Yeah, and I mean, Brad and I have talked about in the past that I don't want to say it's a prove-it year for Dabo, but, for someone who had that run for
the dynasty, so to
a
speak.
good 5-year chunk there, all of a sudden it's like, oh, what happened to that team? And I think the talent is obviously still there because they are, I think, the most equipped talent-wise in the ACC. It's just, can they put it all together?
Correct. Can they put it all together? And one final note, too, speaking of coaches, on the opposite side of the transfer portal problem, we have Mel Tucker, Michigan State, making a statement in his first year, bringing a ton of talent in. They had a fantastic run. And has been anything but since, and Phil is down on Michigan State.
Well,
Maryland could likely eclipse them, it sounds like, in the conference. And, for all this positivity of the Big Ten, it will be awfully weird to see a down Sparty 2 years in a row.
Yeah, well, at least, like you said, if Sparty's down, we need some of these other teams to come up, whether it's an Illinois team that's looking pretty strong.
Exactly.
Or, like you said, Maryland is no longer the laughingstock of the Big Ten.
Correct.
I mean, they used to be in the same conversation as Rutgers, and I think Rutgers is that lone team anymore in this conference.
And he also said, watch out for the Badgers, which if the Badgers and the Hawkeyes in the West are good, watch out.
That helps.
All of a sudden, the West could be a little bit of a different ball game.
Yeah, for sure. And, they'll be jumping around, hopefully.
I think there will be some jumping around, that's for sure. The Luke Fickell show has arrived. So we'll have much more about college football as we're leading up to it. It's not too far out from week 0 at this point, which is insane to think about. For Dave Shiner and for Brett Thacker, wherever he is in the mountains, he might not even have reception to get this podcast
You never
right
know.
now. We don't know. But again, you can follow us, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, also Amazon, Google, basically wherever you can find your podcasts, abc27.com, and on YouTube, WHTM ABC27. You can find us, I promise. You can find us, right?
Oh, you're always available to me. Don't worry about that.
Like and subscribe, please, and thank you. Thank you for listening, everyone. Until next week, this is Weather Wagers. Take care, everybody.